They say blood is thicker than water, but apparently greed is thicker than both. My name is Robert Miller, and I died alone in room 247 of Sunset Manor Care Facility, while my daughter was probably already measuring my house for new furniture. But here's the thing about death. Sometimes it gives you a second chance to settle the score. And when I opened my eyes 6 months before that nursing home, I knew exactly what Jessica had planned for me. This time, though, I was ready. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time around, I was completely blind to what was happening. Sitting in my kitchen at 847 Maple Street on that crisp October morning, I watched Jessica pour herself coffee with the same caring smile she'd worn since childhood. Her husband, Mark, sat across from me, scrolling through his phone with that perpetual frown he'd developed since his construction business started failing. I should have seen the signs then, but a father's love makes you stupid sometimes. "Dad, we've been thinking," Jessica began, her voice carrying that gentle tone she used when she wanted something expensive as a kid. "You've been living alone? In this big house, since Mom passed? Don't you think it might be time to consider some help?" Back then, I laughed it off. I was 68, sure, but I could still mow my own lawn and cook my own meals. My Margaret had been gone for 5 years, and this house held every memory we'd built together. The thought of leaving seemed impossible, but Jessica was persistent, like water slowly wearing down stone. "We're just worried about you," Mark chimed in, finally looking up from his phone. "What if something happens and nobody's around? Mrs. Williams next door is getting up there in age too." Dorothy Williams had been our neighbor for 30 years. She was sharp as a tack and probably in better shape than Mark, but I didn't argue. I just nodded and promised to think about it, the way you promise a child you'll consider getting them a pony. What I didn't know then was that Jessica had already been inside Sunset Manor 3 times, touring the facilities and asking about payment plans. I didn't know that Mark's construction company wasn't just struggling. It was drowning in debt from a shopping center project that had gone sideways. And I certainly didn't know that my own daughter had spent the last 2 months consulting with lawyers about elder care laws and something called emergency guardianship. The conversations continued for weeks, each one a little more urgent than the last. Jessica would stop by with groceries I didn't need, commenting on how the house felt too big and too much work for someone my age. She'd point out the creaky stair railing that had been creaky for 20 years. Or mention how the furnace was getting old even though I'd had it serviced just that spring. "You know, Dad," she said one evening, as we sat in the living room, where Margaret used to read her romance novels. I was talking to Patricia Davis at Sunset Manor. She's the director there. And she says they have some wonderful programs for seniors. It's not like the old nursing homes you're thinking of. They have game nights and book clubs and even gardening activities. The way she described it, you'd think Sunset Manor was some kind of luxury resort instead of the sterile facility. It actually was. But I listened because she was my daughter, and because some small part of me wondered if maybe she was right. Maybe I was getting too old for this house, and maybe I was becoming a burden. That was my first mistake, doubting myself instead of trusting my instincts. The pressure increased gradually, so subtly that I barely noticed. Jessica started visiting. More often, but always with a purpose. She'd reorganized my medicine cabinet, claiming it was safer to have everything in weekly pill organizers. She convinced me to let her handle my monthly bills, saying it would be one less thing to worry about. She even got me to sign papers giving her access to my bank accounts just in case of emergency. Each concession felt reasonable in isolation. After all, this was Jessica, the little girl who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them flowers. The teenager who cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak. The young woman who'd asked for my blessing before marrying Mark. How could I possibly suspect that she was systematically dismantling my independence? Mark's role became clearer as the weeks passed. He'd drop comments about property values in our neighborhood, mentioning how much houses were selling for on Maple Street. "Your place has got to be worth at least 280, maybe 300, he'd say, as if he were just making conversation. Of course, the market's always changing. Strike while the iron's hot, you know? I should have asked him why he cared about my house's value. I should have wondered why Jessica suddenly became so interested in my daily routine, asking detailed questions about when I went to bed, when I woke up, whether I was eating enough. But hindsight is 20/20, and at the time, I mistook manipulation for genuine concern. The turning point came on a Thursday in November. I'd had a small dizzy spell while reaching for something in the top cabinet. Nothing serious, just stood up too fast. But when Jessica arrived for her usual visit and I mentioned it offhandedly, her reaction was immediate and intense. "Dad, this is exactly what we've been worried about," she exclaimed, her face a perfect mask of concern. "What if you'd fallen? What if you'd hit your head? Could have been lying there for hours before anyone found you, before I could." Protest that it was just a momentary dizziness. She was on the phone with someone. I caught fragments of the conversation. Evaluation, unsafe living conditions, immediate assessment. When she hung up, she informed me that she'd arranged for a social worker to visit the next day. "Just to make sure everything's okay," she assured me. "It's standard procedure. It's nothing to worry about." But I was starting to worry. Not about my health or my ability to live independently, but about the speed with which Jessica seemed to have solutions ready for problems I didn't think I had. It was like she'd been planning for this conversation long before my dizzy spell. Gave her the excuse to have it. That night, alone in the house that had been my sanctuary for 43 years, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Jessica loved me, I was certain of that. But there was something else driving her urgency, something that made her push just a little too hard, move just a little too fast. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but I felt like a frog in slowly heating water, not realizing I was being cooked until it was too late. The social worker arrived exactly on time the next morning. Mrs. Sarah Coleman was professional and kind, but she asked pointed questions about my daily routine, my social connections, my financial management. Jessica had positioned herself as my primary caregiver and point of contact, answering questions on my behalf, even when they were directed at me. "Mr. Miller seems to be managing well," Mrs. Coleman concluded, "but I do see some areas of concern. Living alone at your age, with limited family support nearby, does present certain risks." Limited family support. Jessica lived 20 minutes away and visited multiple times per week, but somehow that had been reframed as inadequate. I started to understand that this wasn't really about my well-being. At all, it was about building a case. As Mrs. Coleman left, she handed Jessica a packet of information about care options and family resources. Jessica thanked her profusely, promising to explore all possibilities for my safety and comfort. That evening, as I sat in my recliner watching the news, I realized that my life was being quietly reorganized around me. Jessica had inserted herself into every aspect of my independence, from my finances to my health care, all under the guise of loving concern. And now there was official documentation suggesting that I might need more supervision than I was getting. I thought about Margaret then, and what she would have said about all this. She'd always been better at reading people than I was, better at seeing through pretty words to hidden motivations. "Bobby," she used to say, "watch what people do, not what they say. Actions tell the real story." Looking back at Jessica's actions, over the past few months, a disturbing pattern emerged. She wasn't trying to help me stay independent. She was systematically removing my independence. She wasn't addressing problems I had. She was creating problems I didn't have. She wasn't preparing me for my future. She was preparing for hers. But I still didn't fully understand just how far she was willing to go, or how little my own wishes would matter when her plan reached its final stage. I was still thinking like a father who trusted his daughter, not like a man whose own child was positioning him as an obstacle to be removed. That innocence wouldn't last much longer. The next 3 months became a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as family concern. Jessica's visits increased to almost daily occurrences, each one chipping away at another piece of my autonomy. She'd arrive with prepared meals that I didn't ask for, insisting that my cooking wasn't nutritious enough. When I protested that I'd been feeding myself perfectly fine for 70 years, she'd smile that patient smile and say, "Dad, you're not getting any younger. We just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself." Mark started showing up more frequently too, always with some repair project that allegedly needed immediate attention. The loose doorknob that had been loose for 15 years suddenly became a safety hazard. The back porch steps that Margaret and I had climbed thousands of times were now dangerously uneven. Each repair came with a lecture about how the house was becoming too much for me to maintain properly. The pattern was insidious. They'd identify a minor issue, magnify its importance, then position themselves as the solution. When the bathroom faucet developed a small drip, Mark insisted on replacing the entire fixture. When a few shingles came loose during a storm, he declared the roof a potential disaster waiting to happen. Every maintenance issue became evidence that I was failing to keep up with homeownership. What really bothered me wasn't the repairs themselves, but the way they documented everything. Jessica started taking photos of issues before and after Mark fixed them. She kept detailed lists of expenses and safety concerns. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough, maybe preparing information for insurance claims. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I realize she was building a portfolio of evidence showing that the house was deteriorating under my care. The financial manipulation started subtly. Jessica had convinced me to let her help with my monthly bills, claiming it would simplify things for me. First, she'd sit at my kitchen table and go through everything together, explaining each payment, and asking for my approval. Gradually, she began taking the bills home to organize them better, returning with payment summaries instead of the actual statements. "Everything's taken care of, Dad," she'd say cheerfully. "The electric bill was a little high this month, but I paid it online to save you the trip to the bank." When I asked to see the actual bills, she'd wave me off. "Don't worry about all those confusing numbers. I've got it handled. You should be relaxing, not stressing over paperwork." Relaxing. That word became her constant refrain. I should be relaxing instead of cooking, cleaning, maintaining my house, or managing my own finances. According to Jessica, relaxation was the only appropriate activity for someone my age. Everything else was too stressful, too dangerous, or too complicated for an elderly man to handle. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of their strategy. Jessica began intercepting my mail, claiming she was helping me organize important documents. Phone calls to the house started going through her first, with Jessica explaining to callers that I was resting or not feeling up to visitors. My old friend Henry from the factory stopped coming by for our weekly chess games after Jessica told him I was having memory issues and might not remember him consistently. Dorothy Williams, my neighbor of 30 years, mentioned that Jessica had spoken to her about my declining condition. According to Jessica, I'd been having episodes of confusion and disorientation that worried the family. Dorothy looked at me with such pity during that conversation that I wanted to shake her and explain that my mind was as sharp as ever. But Jessica was there, nodding sadly and adding details about incidents that had never happened. Last week, he forgot he'd already taken his medication and almost took a double dose. Jessica told Dorothy while I stood right there. And yesterday I found him looking for Mom in the bedroom. Just breaks my heart to see him struggling. Like this. I tried to correct her, to explain that I'd never done any of those things. But Jessica just patted my shoulder and gave Dorothy a meaningful look. "He doesn't always remember these episodes," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "The doctor says it's common for people with early dementia to have gaps in memory." Early dementia. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I'd never been diagnosed with dementia, early or otherwise. I'd never even discussed memory issues with any doctor. But somehow in Jessica's version of reality, I was a confused old man who couldn't be trusted to remember his own experiences. The medical appointments began soon after. Jessica scheduled them without consulting me, simply announcing that Dr. Patricia Hamilton wanted to see me for a routine checkup. When I asked why I needed to see a doctor I'd never heard of, instead of Dr. Roberts, who'd been my physician for 15 years, Jessica explained that Dr. Hamilton specialized in geriatric care and would be better equipped to address my specific needs. Dr. Hamilton's office felt more like an interrogation than a medical examination. She asked detailed questions about my daily routine, my social connections, my ability to manage household tasks. Most concerning were her questions about my mental state. Did I ever feel confused? Did I sometimes forget where I put things? Had I noticed any changes in my mood or behavior? Jessica sat in on the entire appointment, occasionally adding her own observations about my supposed declining abilities. When Dr. Hamilton asked if I had any concerns about my health, Jessica answered before I could speak. "He's been having some balance issues," she said. "Sometimes he seems disoriented when he first wakes up. I've found him looking confused about where he is a few times." Again, none of this was true. But Dr. Hamilton wrote everything down in my file as if Jessica's word was more reliable than my own. When I tried to contradict these claims, Dr. Hamilton smiled kindly and made notes about patient denial and lack of insight into condition. The appointment ended with Dr. Hamilton recommending a comprehensive geriatric assessment and suggesting that my family consider increased supervision for my safety. She handed Jessica a referral to something called the Riverside Senior Care Assessment Center, along with pamphlets about various levels of assisted living. Walking out of that office, I felt like I'd been diagnosed with a disease I didn't have by a doctor who'd known me for less than an hour. Jessica chatted happily about the appointment as we drove home, praising Dr. Hamilton's thoroughness and expressing relief that we were finally getting some professional guidance about my care. The assessment center appointment was scheduled for the following week. Jessica handled all the arrangements, explaining that I shouldn't worry about the details since the evaluation might be overwhelming for someone in my condition. She even took time off work to drive me there, despite my insistence that I was perfectly capable of driving myself. The Riverside Senior Care Assessment Center occupied a modern building downtown, all glass and chrome with motivational posters about aging with dignity. The staff members were professionally cheerful, speaking to me in the slow, loud voices typically reserved for children or people with significant hearing impairments. Even though my hearing was fine, they seemed convinced that anyone over 65 needed extra volume and simplified vocabulary. The assessment took 3 hours and covered everything from my ability to balance on one foot to my recall of 3 random words after a 5-minute delay. I performed well on every test, but the evaluator, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, seemed more interested in Jessica's observations than my actual performance. "Family input is crucial in these assessments," Sarah explained to me as if I weren't sitting right there. "Sometimes family members notice changes that the individual might not be aware of themselves." Jessica had come prepared with a detailed list of concerns. According to her documentation, I'd been experiencing increased forgetfulness, occasional disorientation, and several near falls that she claimed to have witnessed. She'd even brought photographs of the house repairs Mark had completed, presenting them as evidence that I was no longer capable of maintaining my property safely. The most damaging part of her presentation was a log she'd been keeping of my daily activities. For the past month, she claimed she'd been checking on me multiple times per day and recording her observations. The log painted a picture of a man struggling with basic tasks, forgetting appointments, and showing signs of increasing confusion and agitation. Reading through that log was like looking at the life of a stranger, according to Jessica's records. I'd called her 6 times in one day, asking the same question about my medication. I'd supposedly left the stove on overnight multiple times. I'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store I'd been shopping at for 20 years. None of these incidents had actually happened, but they were recorded in Jessica's careful handwriting, with dates and times that made them seem absolutely credible. Sarah Jenkins reviewed the assessment results with Jessica while I sat in the waiting room, presumably because the discussion might be too complex for my allegedly declining mind to follow. When they called me back in, Sarah's expression had shifted from professional courtesy to gentle concern. "Mr. Miller," she began, "based on your assessment and your daughter's observations, we have some recommendations for your care. While you're still functioning at a relatively high level, there are some areas of concern that suggest you might benefit from additional support." The recommendations included daily check-ins from a home health aide, weekly visits from a social worker, and gradual transition, planning toward a more supervised living environment. Sarah stressed that these were just suggestions designed to ensure my safety and well-being. But the message was clear. I was being deemed incompetent to live independently. Jessica accepted all the recommendations enthusiastically, promising to research home health agencies and assisted living facilities immediately. She asked detailed questions about the transition process and seemed particularly interested in the legal aspects of care decisions for elderly family members. As we left the assessment center, I felt like I'd been sentenced to a crime I didn't commit. In the span of a few months, I'd gone from being a capable, independent man to being classified as a safety risk who needed constant supervision. The most terrifying part wasn't the loss of independence itself, but the realization that my own daughter had orchestrated every step of this process. That evening, I sat in my living room surrounded by 43 years of memories and tried to understand how my life had been so completely hijacked. Every system designed to protect elderly people from abuse had been turned against me by the one person I trusted most. Jessica had used her position as my loving daughter to convince everyone else that I was incapable of making my own decisions. The real genius of her strategy was that she'd made herself indispensable while simultaneously proving my incompetence. Every task she took over became evidence that I couldn't handle it myself. Every problem she solved demonstrated my inability to manage my own life. She'd created a narrative where her increasing control was not only justified but necessary for my survival. And the most insidious part was that she'd convinced everyone, including the professionals who were supposed to advocate for my rights, that she was doing all of this out of love. The breaking point came on a cold February morning, when I woke up to find strangers in my kitchen. 3 people I'd never seen before were cataloging my belongings, making notes on clipboards, and discussing my living room furniture as if I weren't standing right there in my bathrobe. "Dad, these are the assessors from Harmony Home Solutions," Jessica announced cheerfully, as if having strangers inventory your possessions at 7 in the morning was perfectly normal. "They're just doing a preliminary evaluation to help us understand what kind of care transition would work best for you." I hadn't agreed to any evaluation, certainly hadn't invited these people into my home, yet here they were, measuring my hallways and testing my stair railings while Jessica followed behind them with encouraging nods and helpful commentary about my supposed limitations. "The stairs are definitely a concern," one assessor noted. A thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced herself as Linda Morrison, at Mr. Miller's age, with his documented balance issues. "This presents a significant fall risk." Balance issues. I'd never had balance issues until Jessica started claiming I did. But somehow these fictional problems had become part of my official medical record, following me from appointment to appointment like a shadow I couldn't shake. "And this kitchen layout isn't ideal for someone with early cognitive decline," added the second assessor, a younger man who kept tapping his pen against his clipboard. "Too many cabinets, too many potential hazards." "The gas stove is particularly concerning. I'd been cooking on that gas stove for 4 decades without incident. Margaret had prepared thousands of family meals on that same stove. But according to these strangers, it was now a weapon waiting to kill me." The third assessor, an older gentleman named Frank, focused on what he called environmental safety factors. He examined my bathroom, declaring the tub a drowning hazard and the medicine cabinet improperly organized. He tested my smoke detectors, checked my electrical outlets, and made notes about the general maintenance decline of the property. "When was the last time the furnace was serviced?" Frank asked Jessica, ignoring the fact that I was standing right there and could answer for myself. "Dad's been struggling to keep up with routine maintenance," Jessica replied smoothly. "Mark's been helping when he can, but it's becoming overwhelming for all of us. The furnace had been serviced 3 months ago. I had the paperwork to prove it." But when I tried to interject with this information, Linda Morrison smiled at me with condescending patience and made a note about patient attempting to minimize safety concerns. The most disturbing part of the evaluation was how efficiently Jessica had answers for every question. "When had I last fallen?" "Last Tuesday in the bathroom," she replied without hesitation. "When had I forgotten to turn off appliances?" "He left the coffee maker on overnight just last week." "And had I shown signs of confusion?" "Yesterday he couldn't remember our neighbor's name, and he's known Dorothy for 30 years. None of these incidents had happened. I'd never fallen in the bathroom, never left appliances on, and I remembered Dorothy Williams's name better than I remembered my own social security number. But Jessica delivered each lie with such conviction that the assessors wrote everything down as established fact. "Has he had any episodes of wandering or disorientation?" Linda asked, her pen poised above her clipboard. "A few weeks ago, I found him standing in the driveway at 2 in the morning in his pajamas," Jessica answered. "He said he was looking for Mom, but Mom passed away 5 years ago. It was heartbreaking. I wanted to scream, wanted to grab that clipboard and throw it across the room. I wanted to demand these people leave my house immediately, but I'd learned that any display of emotion or frustration would be interpreted as further evidence of my mental decline. Angry old man loses his temper during safety evaluation. It's clearly unfit for independent living." So I stood there silently, while my daughter systematically destroyed my reputation and my life with a series of carefully crafted lies. The evaluation concluded with Linda Morrison explaining their findings to Jessica as if I'd suddenly become invisible. Based on their assessment, I was at high risk for falls, fires, medication errors, and general self-neglect. They recommended immediate transition to a supervised care environment, preferably within the next 30 days. "We understand this is difficult," Linda said to Jessica with practiced sympathy. "But Mr. Miller's safety has to be the priority. The longer he remains in an unsupervised environment, the greater the risk of a serious incident." Jessica nodded gravely, playing the role of the concerned daughter perfectly. "I've been so worried about exactly that. Just want what's best for him, but it's hard to know how to help someone who doesn't recognize they need help." After the assessors left, Jessica sat me down at my own kitchen table and pulled out a folder thick with brochures and paperwork. Inside were glossy promotional materials for half a dozen senior living facilities, each one promising comfort, safety, and round-the-clock care for elderly residents. "Dad, I know this is hard to accept," she began, her voice taking on that gentle, patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "But the professionals all agree that you need more support than we can provide at home. These places aren't like the old nursing homes. They're communities designed for people exactly like you, people exactly like me." Apparently that meant confused, incompetent, and dangerous to themselves and others. According to the narrative Jessica had constructed, I was a walking disaster waiting to happen, too mentally impaired to recognize my own limitations. She spread the brochures across the table like a real estate agent showing houses to prospective buyers. Each facility looked pleasant enough in the photographs, with smiling residents playing games, tending gardens, and enjoying group activities. But all I could see were the locked doors, the scheduled meal times, the complete loss of autonomy that these places represented. "Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation," Jessica continued, pointing to a brochure featuring a cheerful dining room full of elderly people. "Patricia Davis, the director, has been so helpful in explaining their programs. They have memory care specialists, physical therapy, even pet therapy sessions. Memory care specialists for the dementia I didn't have, physical therapy for the mobility issues I didn't have, pet therapy for the depression I was apparently supposed to develop once they stripped away everything that gave my life meaning. I've already put down a deposit to hold a room," Jessica added casually, as if this information was just a minor detail. "It's refundable if we decide to look at other options, but rooms fill up quickly at the better facilities." She'd put down a deposit without asking me. She'd committed my money to institutionalize me against my will, and she was presenting this as a thoughtful gesture, like making dinner reservations at my favorite restaurant. That's when I realized that all the evaluations, assessments, and professional recommendations weren't really about determining whether I needed care. They were about building an unassailable legal case for removing me from my home. Jessica wasn't trying to convince me to move to a nursing home voluntarily. She was preparing to have me declared incompetent so she could make the decision for me. The folder contained more than just facility brochures. Buried beneath the cheerful marketing materials were legal documents with intimidating titles, like Petition for Emergency Guardianship and Medical Power of Attorney. There were forms for transferring property management, authorizing medical decisions, and something called protective placement proceedings. Been consulting with Michael Chen at Miller and Associates, Jessica explained when she saw me examining the legal paperwork. He specializes in elder law, He's helped us understand the process for ensuring you get the care you need, even if you're not comfortable with the idea initially. Even if I'm not comfortable with the idea. Those lawyers speak for even. If you refuse, they were preparing to override my objections, dismiss my preferences, and institutionalize me against my will. And they'd convinced themselves this was an act of love. I looked at Jessica then, really looked at her, and tried to find some trace of the daughter I'd raised. The little girl who used to climb onto my lap for bedtime stories, the teenager who'd called me her hero, the young woman who'd promised to take care of me when I got old. But that person was gone, replaced by someone who could lie to medical professionals, manipulate legal systems, and destroy her father's life while maintaining the perfect facade of devoted family concern. The transformation was so complete that I wondered if I'd ever really known her at all. "When do you want to schedule the tour?" Jessica asked, apparently interpreting my silence as acceptance. Patricia suggested we visit during their afternoon activity time so you can see how engaging their programs are. I wanted to tell her I wasn't going anywhere. I wanted to explain that this house was my home, that these were my possessions, that this was my life to live as I chose. I wanted to remind her that I was still a competent adult, with rights that couldn't be simply signed away by concerned family members. But I'd learned that resistance only strengthened her case against me. Every argument I made would be characterized as confusion. Every refusal would be labeled as lack of insight. Every assertion of my independence would become evidence that I was too impaired to make rational decisions. So instead, I smiled and nodded and told her I'd think about it. I played the role of the agreeable old man who was slowly coming to terms with his limitations. I'd let her believe she'd won. But inside I was planning something Jessica couldn't have anticipated. I was finally ready to stop being a victim of her manipulation and start fighting back. The question was no longer whether I could prevent her from stealing my life. The question was whether I could expose her lies before she succeeded in having me declared incompetent. I had maybe 2 weeks before the legal machinery she'd set in motion would crush my remaining autonomy. 2 weeks to gather evidence, find allies, and prove that I was the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by my own daughter. 2 weeks to save myself from the woman who was supposed to love me most. My investigation started with something. Jessica hadn't counted on my friendship with Dorothy Williams. For 30 years, Dorothy had been more than just a neighbor. She'd been Margaret's closest confidant and my most trusted friend. When I knocked on her door that Tuesday evening, she welcomed me with the same warm smile she'd always had, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Bob, I'm so glad you came by," she said, ushering me into her cozy living room. "I've been meaning to talk to you, but Jessica said you weren't feeling up to visitors." That was my opening. I spent the next hour carefully explaining what had really been happening, showing Dorothy the assessment documents Jessica had left behind, and asking her to recall the specific conversations she'd had with my daughter. What emerged was a clear pattern of manipulation that made Dorothy's face grow paler with each revelation. "She told me you'd been having memory episodes," Dorothy said slowly. "But Bob, you seem sharp as ever. These incidents she described. Dive. Never witnessed anything like that. You talk almost every day when you're working in your garden." Dorothy agreed to help, and more importantly, she agreed to start documenting our daily interactions. If Jessica's case against me relied on claims that I was isolated and confused, Dorothy's testimony could prove otherwise. But we needed more than just her word against Jessica's carefully constructed narrative. The breakthrough came when I decided to visit Dr. Roberts, my longtime physician. I hadn't seen him since Jessica redirected my care to Dr. Hamilton. But his nurse agreed to squeeze me in for an urgent appointment. Dr. Roberts had been treating me for over 15 years, and his reaction to the reports in my file was immediate and decisive. "Hey, Bob, this doesn't sound like you at all," he said after reviewing the documentation from Dr. Hamilton and the assessment center. "These cognitive symptoms came on very suddenly according to these reports. When did you first notice? Memory problems?" "I haven't noticed any memory problems," I replied, because I haven't had any. Dr. Roberts conducted his own cognitive assessment, far more thorough than anything Dr. Hamilton had done. He tested my memory, my reasoning abilities, my awareness of current events, and my understanding of my own medical history. After an hour of testing, his conclusion was unambiguous. "There's absolutely nothing wrong with your cognitive function," he stated firmly. Your memory is excellent. Your reasoning is sound, and you show no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. I'm going to document this in your file and send copies to Dr. Hamilton and the assessment center. Armed with Dr. Roberts' evaluation, I made my next move. I contacted Stephen Hayes at First National Bank, where I'd done business for over 20 years. Stephen had handled my mortgage, my retirement accounts, and knew my financial habits better than anyone. When I asked to review all my recent account activity, what we discovered made my blood run cold. Jessica hadn't just been paying my bills, she'd been systematically draining my accounts. Small amounts at first, withdrawn as emergency expenses or medical costs, but the pattern escalated quickly. In the past 3 months, she'd transferred nearly $40,000 from my savings account to various accounts I didn't recognize. Mr. Miller, I have to ask, Stephen said carefully, did you authorize these transfers? Because if you didn't, we're looking at financial elder abuse. The documentation Stephen provided painted a devastating picture. Jessica had used her power of attorney not to protect my interests, but to systematically steal from me. The home repairs Mark had completed were charged to my accounts at inflated prices. The medical appointments with Dr. Hamilton were being billed directly to my insurance and checking account. Even the deposit at Sunset Manor had been paid with my money. But the most shocking discovery was a life insurance policy Jessica had taken out on me 6 months ago. A $500,000 policy with herself as the sole beneficiary, paid for with automatic withdrawals from my checking account. The policy included an accelerated death benefit clause, meaning Jessica could collect a portion of the money if I became terminally ill or permanently incapacitated. Stephen helped me gather copies of every transaction, every transfer, and every unauthorized charge. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Jessica wasn't trying to put me in a nursing home out of concern for my well-being. She was positioning herself to inherit my house, my savings, and my life insurance while I was still alive to watch it happen. With Dr. Roberts' cognitive assessment and Stephen's financial documentation, I finally had the ammunition I needed to fight back. But I needed legal help, and I knew I couldn't trust Michael Chen, the lawyer Jessica had been consulting. Instead, Dorothy recommended her nephew, David Williams, who practiced elder law in the county seat. David's office was nothing like the polished corporate environment where Jessica had been planning my legal demise. It was cluttered with case files and family photos, and David himself had the rumpled appearance of someone who cared more about his clients than his appearance. When I laid out the evidence of Jessica's manipulation, his reaction was immediate and angry. "This is textbook financial and psychological elder abuse," he said, spreading the documents across his desk. "Your daughter has been systematically isolating you, undermining your credibility, and stealing your assets. The fact that she's used medical professionals and social services to support her fraud makes it even more serious," David explained. "That Jessica's plan was actually quite sophisticated. By establishing a pattern of supposed cognitive decline and safety concerns, she was building a case for emergency guardianship. Once granted guardianship, she could legally control every aspect of my life, including where I lived, how my money was spent, and what medical care I received. The beauty of her scheme," David said grimly, "is that once you're in the nursing home, it becomes much harder to prove you don't belong there. The isolation, the medication, the institutional environment, all of that can actually create the cognitive decline she's been claiming you already have." But David also had good news. Evidence I'd gathered was strong enough to stop Jessica's guardianship petition and potentially pursue criminal charges for financial abuse. However, he warned me that Jessica would likely escalate her efforts. Once she realized I was fighting back, "She's invested too much in this plan to give up easily," he cautioned. "And she's already positioned herself as your primary caregiver in the eyes of multiple institutions. We need to move quickly and decisively." David filed an emergency motion to freeze my accounts and revoke Jessica's power of attorney. He also submitted Dr. Roberts' cognitive assessment to the court, directly contradicting the claims made by Dr. Hamilton and the assessment center. Most importantly, he arranged for an independent geriatric psychiatrist to conduct a comprehensive evaluation that would definitively establish my mental competency. The legal counterattack was swift and effective. But David had been right about Jessica's response. Within hours of the bank freezing the accounts she'd been accessing, my phone started ringing. Jessica was frantic, demanding to know why she couldn't access my accounts to pay my bills. "Dad, there must be some mistake," she said when she arrived. At my house that evening, her usual composure cracking around the edges. "The bank says someone has put a hold on your accounts. Did you do something? Are you confused about your finances again?" Even now, facing the collapse of her elaborate scheme, she was still trying to gaslight me. Still trying to convince me that I was the confused one, that I was the problem that needed to be managed and controlled. "I'm not confused, Jessica," I replied calmly. "I know exactly what you've been doing." For the first time in months, I saw genuine fear in my daughter's eyes. Not concern for my well-being, not worry about my safety, but fear of being caught. Fear of facing consequences for what she'd done. "I don't know what you think I've been doing," she said carefully, "but everything I've done has been for your own good." "You're not thinking clearly, Dad. You need help." "The only thing I need help with," I replied, "is stopping you from stealing my life." The mask finally slipped completely. The loving, concerned daughter disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone capable of cold calculation and ruthless manipulation, someone who had been willing to destroy her own fathers. "Life for money. You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice turning hard. "You think you can handle your own affairs, but you can't. You're old, you're declining, and whether you admit it or not, you need supervision." I was trying to do this the easy way, but if you want to make it difficult, that's your choice. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The guardianship hearing is next week. When the judge sees all the evidence of your deteriorating, condition all the professional recommendations, all the safety incidents. You'll be declared incompetent whether you cooperate or not. And when that happens, I'll be making all your decisions for you." After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal and tried to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't a daughter who had lost her way or made some bad decisions under pressure. This was someone who had planned and executed a calculated campaign to destroy my independence and steal my assets. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I had allies now, evidence and legal representation. Most importantly, I had the truth on my side. Jessica's web of lies was beginning to unravel, and she knew it. The confrontation I'd been dreading for months was finally here. But I was no longer the helpless victim she'd been manipulating. I was fighting back, and I intended to win. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at the Riverside County Courthouse. Jessica arrived with her lawyer, Michael Chen, a stack of medical files, and the confidence of someone who believed she held all the winning cards. She wore a navy blue dress that made her look both professional and sorrowful. The perfect costume for a devoted daughter, forced to make painful decisions about her declining father. I sat across the courtroom with David Williams, surrounded by our own evidence and a surprise Jessica hadn't expected. Detective Maria A. Santos from the Riverside Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Stephen Hayes had filed a formal complaint about the unauthorized transfers from my accounts. Detective Santos had spent the week building a criminal case against my daughter. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order and began reviewing the petition for emergency guardianship. Michael Chen presented their case with polished efficiency, painting me as a danger to myself and others. He submitted Dr. Hamilton's reports, the assessment center's recommendations, and Jessica's detailed logs of my supposed incidents of confusion and disorientation. "Your Honor," Chen argued, "Mr. Miller's condition has deteriorated rapidly over the past 6 months. As his family has made heroic efforts to provide care at home, but the safety risks have become unmanageable. The petitioner is seeking guardianship only as a last resort to protect her father from serious harm." Jessica testified next, delivering a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She spoke about finding me confused and disoriented about her fears for my safety, about the heartbreak of watching her father's mind deteriorate. She even managed to produce tears when describing how difficult it was to consider placing me in a care facility. "I love my father more than anything," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "This is the hardest decision I've ever had to make." But I can't live with myself if something terrible happens to him because I was too selfish to get him the help he needs. Then it was our turn. David Williams stood up and requested permission to present new evidence that had come to light since the petition was filed. Judge Morrison agreed, and David began dismantling Jessica's case, piece by piece. First came Dr. Roberts' comprehensive cognitive evaluation, which directly contradicted every claim of mental decline in Jessica's documentation. Then came the financial records from First National Bank, showing the systematic theft of nearly $60,000 from my accounts over the past 4 months. Your Honor, David said, presenting bank statements with highlighted transactions. This case isn't about an elderly man who needs protection. It's about financial elder abuse perpetrated by someone who was supposed to be protecting him. Detective Santos took the stand next, explaining how her investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial exploitation. The life insurance policy, the inflated repair bills, the unauthorized medical expenses, all of it painted a picture of someone systematically looting an elderly parent's assets while creating a legal framework to justify the theft. But the most damaging testimony came from Dorothy Williams. My neighbor of 30 years took the witness stand and methodically destroyed every claim Jessica had made about my supposed confusion and isolation. Dorothy testified that she spoke with me daily, that I was fully alert and oriented, and that many of the incidents Jessica had documented simply never happened. I've been keeping my own logs since Mr. Miller asked me to help him, Dorothy said, producing a notebook filled with detailed entries. Every day for the past 3 weeks, I've recorded our conversations and interactions. He shown no signs of confusion, memory loss, or disorientation. In fact, he's been more alert and engaged than usual, probably because he was finally fighting back against what was being done to him. Jessica's composure cracked as Dorothy's testimony continued. Lawyer tried to object, claiming that Dorothy was just a neighbor without medical training, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue. The contrast between Dorothy's detailed, consistent observations and Jessica's increasingly frantic interruptions was impossible to ignore. The courtroom erupted when Detective Santos announced that arrest warrants had been issued for both Jessica and Mark on charges of financial elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. Jessica jumped to her feet, screaming that this was all a misunderstanding, that she was only trying to help me, that I was too confused to understand what was really happening. Judge Morrison called for order and delivered her ruling. Not only was the guardianship petition denied, but she ordered an immediate investigation into how the original medical and social service evaluations had been conducted. Dr. Hamilton and the assessment center would face scrutiny for their roles in supporting what appeared to be a fraudulent guardianship attempt. Mr. Miller, Judge Morrison addressed me directly. The court finds no evidence that you lack the capacity to make your own decisions. The evidence suggests that you have been the victim of a sophisticated scheme designed to convince others that you were incompetent. I'm ordering the immediate restoration of your full legal and financial autonomy. As the bailiffs moved to arrest Jessica and Mark, my daughter turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. Gone was any pretense of love or concern, replaced by the cold fury of someone whose carefully laid plans had been completely destroyed. You think you've won, she hissed as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, but you've lost everything. You'll die alone in that house, and nobody will care. Nobody will even find your body for weeks. Those words should have hurt, but instead they felt like a liberation. The daughter I thought I'd lost had been gone for a long time, probably years before I'd realized it. The person being led away in handcuffs was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, someone capable of cruelty I could never have imagined. 6 months later, Jessica and Mark were both serving prison sentences for financial elder abuse. The house on Maple Street was still mine. My bank accounts were secure. I'd started having weekly dinners with Dorothy Williams, who had become more family to me than my biological daughter ever was. I kept one photograph of Jessica on my mantle, taken when she was 7 years old, and still believed I was her hero. Not to remember the woman who tried to destroy me, but to remember the little girl who once brought me dandelions and called them flowers. The real twist wasn't that my daughter tried to steal my life. It was discovering that some bonds can't be broken by blood or betrayal. Dorothy's loyalty, Dr. Roberts' integrity, David Williams' dedication to justice, and even Detective Santos' commitment to protecting vulnerable seniors had created a new kind of family around me. Jessica had been right about one thing: I was getting older, and someday I might need help. But when that time came, I knew I'd be surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being, not my bank account. And that knowledge was worth more than any inheritance my daughter might have stolen. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge on those who wronged you. Sometimes it's simply discovering who your real family is. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.